welcome to this bonus episode of The Nation Speaks, coming to you from the annual Conservative Political Action Conference, or CPAC, here in Orlando, Florida. I'm your host, Cindy Drucker. Over the 4-day conference, I had the chance to talk to a lot of leaders, thinkers, and entrepreneurs in the conservative movement. On China, I spoke with Senator Bill Hagerty from Tennessee, Representative Scott Perry from Pennsylvania, and China analyst Gordon Chang. So I'm here with Senator Hagerty from Tennessee. Welcome, Senator.
It's wonderful to be here with you today.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about China, and especially since you were ambassador in Japan, you probably know a lot about the pressure that our allies in Asia especially are under with respect to China.
Certainly. I think many Americans know this, but I'll explain it for those that don't. We have more U.S. military stationed in Japan than any place else in the world. Why is that? Because it's a very tough neighborhood. You've got North Korea, Russia, and China right at your doorstep. Every day, American Navy forces are moving in that region, maintaining free seas, free travel, free transit. China has come and maintained these bogus claims to territorial claims to that region. They're building artificial islands along the busiest sea lanes in the world. They're putting themselves in a position to control trade, to affect trade in a way that could be very nefarious for the region and for everybody in the world. We've got to be strong in that area. And if you look at it, China has been aggressive and predatory from a military standpoint, from a diplomatic standpoint, and from an economic standpoint for so many years. And then if you look at what they've done with this virus, they uniquely are responsible for spreading this virus around the world. They tried to cover it up at the very beginning. They silenced researchers. They destroyed samples. They forbade travel from Wuhan to Beijing, from Wuhan to any part of internally in China, while they allowed flights to go from Wuhan to Italy, to North America. They have reaped untold damage on the global economy and on Americans. We've lost over 500,000 American lives right now to this pandemic that they caused.
So how do you think the Biden administration is going to handle this, and maybe in particular the threat to Taiwan?
Well, Taiwan is our ally, and we need to stand as close as we possibly can to Taiwan. Look no further than what's happening in Hong Kong right now. China's backpedaled from all of their promises. They're destroying democracy there in Hong Kong, and I think the Taiwanese rightly are extremely concerned. You couple that with the military aggression that China has posed. They've used the void of this movement into the Biden administration as an opportunity to step up their aggression, and we need to stand strong. China understands a strong America. We cannot be weak at this point, and we certainly can't backslide right now. And I give so much credit to President Trump, because until 2016, during that election, I think both Republicans and Democrats had called it wrong. They talked about the benign influence of China, that China could be a force of good. From 2001, when China entered the WTO, they thought that, well, maybe if China gets access to our markets, they'll realize that ours is the better way. China never had that intention. China's got its own business model, and it means to push their interests forward at the expense of all others. They're a hegemon. They're moving out in the region to do that. They want to move out in the world economy to do that, and we must stand up to them and hold them accountable.
So under the Trump administration, there was a lot of talk about the whole of government approach that's needed to sort of counter the China threats from all directions. But how do you see things going under the Biden administration?
The Trump administration was exactly right. I was just with Ambassador Bob Lighthizer today. He was our U.S. trade representative. And we worked very closely together. First, from a Japanese perspective, to make certain that our trade relationship was as strong as it could be there with our ally, but also to get a reciprocal relationship with China, who has so unfairly dealt with America for so long. And the Trump administration, under President Trump's leadership and Ambassador Lighthizer's hard work, made significant steps pushing back against China and their unfair economic practices. Our military is doing a great job. We significantly increased our presence during my tenure as ambassador in that region. We are pushing back militarily, and we need to push back diplomatically as well. President Trump did that by withdrawing us from the World Health Organization. He saw the influence that China has on the WHO. All they were doing was touting Chinese Communist Party talking points when they made their first foray into China back in January of last year. They allowed, the WHO looked the other way and allowed China to do what they were going to do in terms of spreading this pandemic around the world. I cannot believe that the Biden administration would just go back into the World Health Organization and completely refund them again without holding that organization accountable, without looking at the Chinese influence there. Again, the team that just recently went in to take a look at the virology lab in Wuhan, they were handpicked by China. I wasn't surprised that they didn't really find anything. We know the circumstantial evidence to be quite different. So from a diplomatic standpoint, I'm extraordinarily disappointed by the moves that the Biden administration is taking. I'm going to continue to support and urge and pressure them to maintain our military presence and to continue to stand up economically in a way that maintains American strength and really stands up for the American worker. President Trump set off a blue-collar wave of success for the American worker, bringing our jobs home. Over 500,000 manufacturing jobs created under President Trump's leadership. We've got to maintain that. We cannot backslide because China is waiting there to take those jobs, to take our economy and put our national security at risk.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Senator.
Great to be with you. Thank you so much.
And I'm here with Representative Scott Perry from Pennsylvania. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's talk a little bit about China.
Sure.
From what you've seen so far from the Biden administration, and maybe particularly his answer about China in the recent town hall meeting, what do you think, what are you expecting from this administration in terms of the relationship with China?
I'm expecting the relationship with China if you're looking at it from China's viewpoint, to be very good. Unfortunately, if you're looking at it from an American citizen standpoint, to be troubling at the least. When the President of the United States gets up and tells the rest of us that there are just cultural differences with a regime that is essentially a criminal organization who is, there's credible evidence that they're killing their own people that don't toe the party line, so to speak, that organ harvesting, these horrific things, just the human rights violations, the system of social credits. If that's just a difference in culture, I'm very, very concerned. I mean, would we have said that during the time of Stalin and the gulags, or when Castro was killing and imprisoning people, Pol Pot, Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-il? This is not just differences of culture. This is mass murder conducted by the state, and it cannot be condoned. It can never be condoned. And then, if you look at the Biden administration, the cabinet appointees, it starts at the top, obviously, with the president, goes right to his son, making deals with the Chinese, to John Kerry, whose son, his stepson, also making deals with the Chinese, that John Kerry himself, as the Secretary of State, signed off on the CFIUS board. These are all very, very concerning. Americans don't want to be a party to genocide and to totalitarianism, but yet the top of our federal government is, and it is disgraceful at a minimum.
Yeah, so you first started speaking. You think back to the Cold War and the Soviet era, there was no way we would have, the level of business relationships and dealings that we have with China now, right. Unheard of.
It is unheard of, and it's just, quite honestly, it's just greed. And we understand that business wants to get a part of that $2 billion market in China. But over the last 40 years, we should, at this point, be well familiar with the fact that they pull you in, you make the big investment, they start making sure that they take your technology, and pretty soon they're making what your product is in their country, and they're pushing you out. And so business has to realize this is what's going to happen, but the federal government needs to lead as well. There needs to be one system, one standard for all, not one for the Chinese and another one for American companies. Not one standard for those who want to invest in Chinese companies where there's no accounting looked at. We don't know the validity of these companies. People lose their lives, fortunes. And then another one where American companies have to compete, where all these are very strict and rigid standards. One set of rules for everybody. That's a minimum that the federal government could impose among a million other things. And then, of course, not allowing the agents of China and the Communist Chinese Party to use our own to propagandize on our airwaves and through our legislatures against the best outcome for American citizens. So we really have to view China differently, which is, if you don't know why I introduced a bill in Congress to label the Chinese Communist Party, and I think it's important to separate the people of China from the Chinese Communist Party, but to label the party as a transnational criminal organization, because that's what it is. And just as though we wouldn't do business with the mob knowingly, why are we doing business with these criminals knowingly?
I feel like in the last 4 years or so, there's been such a a greater awareness of the threat that China poses that really hasn't existed before. I feel like it was really siloed.
I think President Trump really brought that front and center. He's the first president in all of our lifetimes to really point out the threat of China. I think that the Wuhan flu, the Wuhan virus, whatever you want to call it, not COVID-19, right? That's what China wants us to call it. I think that that really opened America's eyes, but you can see even now, certainly the media has been tamping that down, and a new Biden administration is tamping down that rhetoric, and kind of people are almost now saying, well, it's just a virus, and not connecting it to China. It is connected to China. It came from China. At a minimum, China was derelict and irresponsible at how they handled it regarding the rest of the world and allowing it to spread, literally sending it out into the world when they knew it happened. Americans need to be reminded every single day of the threat of China, and unfortunately under a Biden administration, we're not going to be able to count on the media, and we're not going to be able to count on this presidency and everything associated with it, and unfortunately the Democrat Party as well, to do any of this work. The rest of us are going to have to do it.
So do you think members of the Biden administration are willfully naive? They have their own interests. They're more interested in a global view of things, not America first. What do you think is behind this?
So yes, yes, and yes.
Okay.
Some are naive, but I think many have interest. You look at, like I said, the Secretary of State. You look across the cabinet. You just look at Secretary of Energy Granholm. Used Chinese equipment and manufacturing and subsidized that in her governorship. 50% of those companies went bankrupt. Then the Chinese literally came in after we subsidized these companies to the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars. Then the Chinese came in and bought those companies in America for pennies on the dollar. I mean, so she's completely invested in it, and she's just one of them. So just look across not only those who have been confirmed, but the nominees. These people are not only enmeshed in it economically themselves personally, but this is a national security threat. None of them should have been confirmed.
So do you think there's any approach? I mean, under President Trump, the idea was a whole of government approach, which was, getting traction. It was going pretty far. Do you think that's what's needed?
Oh, it absolutely is needed. Business is interested in maximizing profits, and so when you know that there's a factory over there making iPhones, there are 230,000 employees at one factory. 230,000. That's a city. America just doesn't have anything at that scale. So manufacturers and businesses are really compelled to go there to compete and maximize their profits. The government needs to be able to step in and say, we want you to maximize profits, and you're American companies, we want you to do well. But there are some limits to what we'll allow you to do for the sake of humanity and for the sake of the future of our country. And they're not incentivized to do that, but that's why government must be incentivized to do it.
So what's it like on the Foreign Affairs Committee? To what extent think you're going to be able to push this view?
Well, I'm going to push the view, but unfortunately my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, they're interested in talking, but they're not interested in doing. So they will have tough rhetoric towards China, but none of it will come out in the form of policy. And it's going to be my job to remind everybody every single day that your vote for a member of Congress on the Foreign Affairs Committee matters if you're concerned about the Chinese Communist Party and the inroads it's making in the United States and the West in general. And if that's important to you, don't elect members that talk big and do nothing. Elect members that are going to do something, even if they don't say anything. It's better to do than just to talk.
And I don't know if you're aware of this news, but in Hong Kong, I think roughly 40 dissidents were just arrested on today or Sunday in Hong Kong, maybe yesterday. And one of them said to the press as he was being taken away or before he went to the police station, like, what did he say exactly? I hope everyone won't give up on Hong Kong.
Right. And here again, the administration has the loudest voice, and there have to be consequences, whether it's tariffs, whether it's at a minimum, it has to be rhetoric, and it can't be rhetoric, well, that is their culture over there, and so we just accept that they beat people over the head and throw them in prison for their viewpoints. And unfortunately, that's the situation that Hong Kong is now, that mainland China is just subsuming everything around it, and Hong Kong is the most most recent victim. And of course, China is not living up to its obligations, the treaties that it signed. There needs to be consequences. The United States, the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, everybody has to be involved in making sure that happens. The United States needs to lead.
Do you think there's a potential that Xi Jinping is looking at the Biden administration as weak on China and could make moves towards Taiwan?
I wouldn't be surprised if Xi Jinping does move on Taiwan in a very much concerted effort. And whether he views the Biden administration as weak on China, I think it almost fails to capture what I think they really, but it's not a matter of being weak on China. He's complicit with China. His son made deals. The Secretary of State, John Kerry, signed the CFIUS affidavits to allow these deals with state-owned enterprises and very critical and sensitive military aviation industry information to be transferred to China. So it's not a matter of being weak on China, it's a matter of literally being in support of China. That's where we are, and people need to see that for what it is, not, well, he's going to be a less strident than President Trump. It's very different than being a part of moving China forward at the peril of the United States of America.
All right, well, our time is up. Thank you so much for joining us today,
Representative
Perry.
Thanks for the opportunity.
I'm here with eminent China analyst Gordon Chang. Gordon, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Cindy.
So I wanted to start by asking you about, China has been boasting about its recovery post-COVID. What do you think is the real situation on the ground there?
Well, first of all, they have continued outbreaks, and those outbreaks are probably larger than they tell us, and probably there are more outbreaks than they let on. The problem for China right now, and it's a fundamental one, is that they don't have a vaccine which is both proven safe and effective. Its effectiveness is maybe in the 60% range, maybe not, because in some trials it's actually been less,
Right.
But also we don't know whether it's safe, and China has not been releasing vaccine data. Now, the United States, although it's behind in the sense that we went into the disease later, we might actually come out of it earlier because we have 3 vaccines now that are proven safe and effective. And that means that we will be able to get back to work and get back as a society. China's going to take a little bit longer to do that. So all of this boasting from Beijing, I think, is, first of all, just a lot of propaganda, but also it's going to be, I think the world is going to see that China's going to take longer to get back.
On a slightly non-economic note, but on the same topic, I remember in the early days there were a lot of videos coming out, showing, the lockdown situations and all of that. There's a lot less of that now coming out of China, which I think helps promote the idea that things aren't so bad. But is that just a suppression of, citizen journalists and people trying to get the word out?
Yeah, I think that we're getting a story which is not really accurate. Now, we don't know to what extent it is inaccurate, but the most important thing for us to focus on is that January of 2020, China announced its coronavirus task force. Now, this was China's way of spearheading its effort, and on the 9-person roster, there was only 1 public health official. The rest were party hacks and propaganda workers, as they're called, which really shows you what China's priority was. And that means when you have stories from China that correspond with China's propaganda narratives, you got to be suspicious. That's just not to say that they're 100% wrong or whatever, but it means that we've got to be concerned about it because we know that China's putting propaganda above public health.
Right, and you see the official numbers of deaths coming out of China, and it's like,
it's absurd.
2 dozen a day or something like that most.
The deaths for the entire country have been, 4,600 or something?
Right, and
they haven't
changed
for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
You're having also the number of infections, I'm sure, is being underreported. And we know that they tell us they don't report asymptomatic cases, which they discuss separately. So they're trying their best to give the impression of a fully recovered society. And I don't think that that's indeed the case at all.
And so what do you think about this vaccine diplomacy? Is it going to backfire the same way, the mask diplomacy did in the early days?
Yeah. First of all, they've really tried hard to say, well, look, the Pfizer vaccine is not safe and all the rest of it. That's just, I think, just a part of this propaganda narrative because they're trying to push their own vaccines. And countries will accept the Chinese vaccines, but only when they can't get the Pfizer and Moderna.
Well, they're a lot cheaper as
So
well,
they're a
right?
lot cheaper, but also people, even in China and outside China, are just refusing to take them. So as a matter of necessity, countries will take Chinese vaccines, but really it's sort of like a last resort move.
Understand. So switching gears a little bit into investment, you were talking on the panel about decoupling from China, something you've been talking about for a few years, or many years. Do you think that's getting harder as China opens up its economy more to direct foreign investment?
I think it's actually getting easier. Now, it's a difficult task. It takes more political will than we have right now. But we do see companies on their own actually decoupling. And the reason is that China's becoming a much more difficult place to do business. Also, China's becoming more expensive as a place to do business. But also, China's trying to use its position in supply chains to achieve geopolitical goals. And that is causing concerns not only for the companies, but especially for countries like ours. So when China threatens to impose a boycott on the export of rare earths to the United States, which I don't think that they will do, but when they threaten that, it makes people in this country realize that we need to develop not only our own source of supply of rare earths, but also our processing capabilities. Because while China does have a large share of the world's production of rare earths, it's got a near monopoly on reprocessing rare earths. So these are things that are starting to make Americans understand we've got to do this because China's hostile.
So I have a couple questions on that. One is, why is it getting harder to do business in China? Why is it getting harder to do business in China?
Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, believes in a state economy. And he sees a role only for foreigners and domestic private entrepreneurs as a means of helping state enterprises. And so after they take their technology and know-how, he really shuts the door to them. So some foreign companies have done well, especially in the car sector. But in many others, the promise just has not panned out. So that's one thing. Also, China is insisting on complete visibility into the networks of foreign companies. So for instance, their computer systems are now supposed to be fully visible to the Communist Party and to the Chinese central government. And that, of course, is a risk for companies, not only in China, because that information can be given to state enterprises that compete with those foreign companies, but also what we're seeing is that once China is in those networks, it makes it easier to penetrate the foreign or the non-China portions of those networks, giving China the ability to steal even more information. So you put a lot of those restrictions together, it means that it is more difficult for companies to do business there, and that is another reason why they are reconsidering.
And what's the status? There was a lot of talk at the beginning of the pandemic of removing supply chains from China. What's the status of that?
It's moving a lot slower than I would like, but we're seeing, though, that companies understand that for a number of reasons they need to diversify. And one of them is simply that there are other better markets. So for instance, India holds more promise. And so we've seen Apple, for instance, announce manufacturing in India. This will take some time, but it is occurring nonetheless. And indeed, the whole environmental movement, just think about this, about carbon emissions. Well, one of the biggest sources of carbon emissions are those huge container ships that cross the Pacific. So if you make goods in the United States for American consumers, you're drastically reducing climate change possibilities. So I think that it's a great thing for us to think about what people call onshoring or proximity manufacturing. We do this, we not only help ourselves reduce our dependence on China, we also may have a little bit of cleaner air.
I don't feel like I hear that line of thinking from environmental groups.
We're doing our best. I mean, we're that shows I'm ineffective, but I knew that all along.
I wouldn't say that. I would say you've been extremely effective. But, it's harder to penetrate some silos of thinking than others.
Well, the environmental movement has really been penetrated by China, and also it is a leftist cause. But once we start breaking it down, they say if you're really serious about climate change, then you really have to be serious about manufacturing close to the consumers. So this really means that if you're a European, you should be manufacturing in Europe. If you're an American, you should be manufacturing in America. And I think this is an idea which eventually will take hold because it goes to the core of the environmental argument. And if not penetrating the environmental activist groups themselves, I think it will be something that the ordinary European or ordinary American or Canadian or Mexican will start thinking about in serious terms.
I mean, I guess from an environmental perspective, the Paris Accord, which doesn't, impose any restrictions on China, that you would think should be in there as well if we're factoring things in appropriately.
Yeah. The Paris Accord is the anti-climate agreement because it has very few restrictions on China. And the most important thing is they say that they will cap emissions, quote unquote, around 2030, which probably for them means 2060 or 2070. But it really is very few requirements on China. The only ones are really energy intensity goals. But for the other countries, very much more in the way of restrictions on their economies in the Paris Agreement. And until you do something about China, it doesn't really help that much. It's like the Kyoto Protocol. Sounds good, won't be enforced, eventually will be abandoned.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We're out of time, but I really appreciate you stopping by.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate this.
That's all for today's show. Thank you so much for watching The Nation Speaks. And join us at our regular time every Saturday, 11 a.m. to noon Eastern. And from all of us here, have a great week.